But I'd like to start with a little brief history of high-speed rail here. Dates back to the 1960s. If I take you back in time there for a minute, in 1964 in Japan, they launched the first Shinkansen bullet train. The following year, Congress here passed the High-Speed Ground Transportation Act. And what that did was provide funding to make some improvements along the Washington, D.C. to New York line and buy some high-speed self-propelled rail cars that reduced transit time between those points and along the route. And that was our kind of first step into the water of high-speed rail. There was some other discussion in the 80s and the 90s. The Federal Railroad Administration began identifying certain corridors that they saw as priorities and good candidates for high-speed rail, including Los Angeles to San Francisco and Miami to Orlando and Tampa. But 6 decades later, we still don't have a new dedicated high-speed route. But we do have one that's under construction, and that's the California project. So actually, I'd like to start with Melissa, if you would, and if you can tell us kind of the status of the California project and perhaps talk about some of the challenges as you're kind of pioneering this project here along the way.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I am a representative of the California High-Speed Rail Authority. I do strategic communications for the authority. And right now, we are proud to have construction in the Central Valley of California along 119 miles, expanding out to 171 miles between the cities of Merced, Fresno, and Bakersfield. We have about 30 active construction sites open right now. We put about 1,100 to 1,300 men and women in the trades to work every day on those job sites. And we are working hard to have passenger service up and running between Merced, Fresno, and Bakersfield, with trains going 220 miles an hour in electrified service by the end of this decade. We are currently designing our 4 Central Valley stations, the first high-speed rail stations in the United States, Merced, Fresno, Bakersfield, and Kings Tulare. And we're just really proud of the work that we get to do every day. We just crossed 10,000 construction jobs created last week. We had a big celebration out in the Central Valley with representatives from the FRA and USDOT joining us, as well as our Secretary of Transportation here in California. It was a really great moment to recognize the men and women from the trades that have been hard at work creating the nation's first system. It's not without challenges, it's not without controversy, but it is truly the right thing to do in the United States at this time. Polling shows that it's still what the public wants. We need federal support to get it done. We are fortunate to have really positive working relationship with the Biden-Harris administration, and we're working with them on federal funding opportunities to continue to advance this program. We will be applying for and hopefully quite competitive in the federal state grant application that's due in April. It's the largest pot of money out of that Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So we're looking towards that and hoping we're successful in that grant application.
Terrific. Roger, I'd like to turn a question to you. You're working now to improve the entire Northeast corridor, the Washington to Boston route, bring in some new trains this year, I believe. Where does high-speed rail fit into the picture of Amtrak?
Well, thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me here today. High-speed rail is a very important part of our Northeast corridor, which is runs about 25% of ridership at Amtrak. So it's a very important area. Acela, which is our high-speed product today, started in year 2000. In the last 22 years, or last 20 years, has really made a huge inroads into the air market. So traditionally, a lot of the business travel in the Northeast corridor flew by air. And since Acela was launched, we've seen about 75% market share between air and rail in the corridor. So we see that as a big win in terms of winning over business travel. Now, when it comes to Acela as a product, high-speed rail, we have high-speed train sets, and what we've been focusing on is upgrading our existing infrastructure to high-speed rail standards. And so we have certain portions of the corridor where the Acela train sets currently operate 150 miles an hour. The new Acela train sets that we'll be getting, hopefully by the end of this year, will be operating up to 160 miles an hour in certain portions as well. Now, we don't have all new builds like other high-speed rail projects have around the world. And partly because we are utilizing existing infrastructure on the approaches into dense urban cores. And this is where we feel it's the existing infrastructure is extremely important and competitive because it can get us into the center of the urban areas at a relatively lower investment. So we're really leveraging both the first generation Acelas and now the coming second generation Acelas to introduce high-speed rail into legacy markets.
Great, thanks, Roger. Ali, I'd like to ask you. When we think about public transportation and passenger rail, we mostly think about publicly funded projects. But you're actually a private investment, and you operate in Florida, and you're looking to build a line from Las Vegas to Southern California. So could you tell me about that project specifically to start with, and then how your role as a private sector company fits into this picture of developing high-speed rail?
Absolutely, Dan, and thanks to you and CoMotion for having us here. I mean, we think that what we're doing is really revolutionary in the transportation market. You know, when you look around the world, it's pretty clear that we have the greatest freight system and the greatest highway system, but our passenger network needs to continue to have improvements, which is obviously why we're talking about this discussion today. Brightline West will, like, as you said, connect Southern California with Las Vegas. We are nearly shovel ready and expect to put a shovel in the ground in the second half of this year. Once that shovel's in the ground, that's about a 3.5 to 4 year build, which would have us operational by the LA Olympics. And we've been able to do that in Florida. Our Florida system was announced in 2012. We started construction several years thereafter. We launched our first phase of Brightline Florida between Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm Beach in 2018. And this year, we are going to be opening that ultimate extension to Orlando, which has really been the highlight, and what we've been working toward. So we're very excited about the future of Brightline. And again, from the private sector's perspective, being able to get these projects off the ground, under construction and operational within a rather short amount of time.
Great, and I'll ask you in a few minutes about your secret on how you do that. But I wanted to bring Jim Matthews into the conversation. Jim, your organization represents rail passengers. So what are you hearing? What are your folks mostly interested in?
So really, Dan, thank you, and thank you to CoMotion for having us here today. So we represent passengers of all kinds. We represent folks who ride long distance trains, commuter trains, regional trains, transit, subway, light rail. And so one of the things that we hear all the time from our members is that they're excited at the prospect of high-speed rail. And indeed, high speed as an idea is one of the 4 major goals of our association, has been really for decades. And so our members are excited to see some of these finally come to fruition. They were excited about the California project. They've been excited about Brightline. They were excited about Texas Central's project. And they're excited to see the new Avila equipment go into service in the Northeast Corridor. So there's a lot of, as Melissa said, there's a lot of demand out there for high-speed rail, and everyone is excited for it. Polling shows that almost universally, even in places that don't have even conventional rail service today. So everyone is kind of waiting for this to happen. One of the things that we believe very strongly, however, is that you're going to have to expand conventional speed service to pave the way for widespread adoption of high-speed rail. And that's okay. This is not an either-or conversation. It builds a domestic industrial base for passenger rail. And you know, passengers are still going to choose trains if there's high frequencies and good reliability. So, you know, some of the things that we can do just to make today's system better will pave the way for more support for high-speed rail around the country. I mean, let's face it, if we could just get to 110 everywhere Amtrak operates today, that would be a phenomenal game-changing change in the way Americans take trains. And it would open people's minds to the idea that, you know, hey, my first shot is to take a train from here to there, rather than saying I'm going to drive. You're already seeing that in Florida with Brightline. You know, people look at the horrible traffic and say, wow, I could jump on in Miami, I can show up in West Palm, and there's a car waiting for me to use as a last mile option. People are making that change, but it's because the service is there to change their mindset.
Great, great. And that brings a question up for Roger. Roger, Amtrak is benefiting from really the largest investment in its entire history through the infrastructure law that was passed a couple of years ago. How is that helping Amtrak? And in terms of what Jim just said about expansion of service, what are we going to see from Amtrak in the coming years?
Good question. So the IIJA really did some, well, it's setting us up to do a lot of really great stuff, some of which is already in the works. The first thing I would say is that it's enabling us to replace all of our fleet. So the new Aero train sets that are coming, which were announced last year for the Northeast Corridor, we have new ALC 42 locomotives for our long distance fleet. And we're in the early stages of a procurement for our new long distance rail cars. So in other words, coaches, sleepers, etc. So by the next decade, we will have been able to replace our entire fleet, which is huge in terms of customer experience. Now, that doesn't get us to the 110 miles an hour, which Jim mentioned, which he's absolutely right on. If we just had, you know, reasonably fast, reliable, frequent service in the US, we would be converting so many current automobile drivers out of their cars and onto the trains, which is what we want to do. So there's a program underway in the to expand service across the US, which the Federal Railroad Administration is administering, called the Corridor ID program. We're assisting them with it. We're currently in the, or the FRA is currently in the submission and processing phase, where they will soon be identifying the candidate corridors. But these, many of these were similar to the Connects Us program that we put out shortly after the IIJA program was announced, where we basically put a map of the US out and said, hey, here's a whole host of markets that we think are very feasible for conventional rail, the 110 mile an hour rail that Jim was talking about. So we're going to be advancing those together with our state partners in the FRA in many markets. We hope those will be coming to market in the next 5 years or so. We have some markets which are going to be in place soon, some that were underway already. You will have seen we launched Burlington, Vermont service last year. We hope to launch our Gulf Coast service between New Orleans and Mobile during this year. The new service between Minneapolis and Chicago this coming year, additional frequencies on the Piedmont service. So there's really tangible benefits to the traveling public in terms of expansion of passenger rail.
Great, great. So we are going to begin to see these services fairly soon.
And we think it's really important to maintain the interest of the public in terms of getting product out there, getting people to try this new service. And, you know, that's one of the things that we saw coming out of COVID is an incredible upswell in interest in rail from people who've never ridden it before. And so this feels like a golden opportunity to convert more of those customers.
Great, great. Before I move on to the next question, we want this to be an interactive webinar here, and we have a poll coming up that I think will come on your screen at home fairly soon, and you can look at that. I think we're going to be asking you on your experience about riding on high-speed trains. But let me go back to Melissa here for a minute and talk about some of the lessons perhaps that you've written, that you've learned from your experience so far.
Absolutely. So being first is never easy, right? Anything that you do in infrastructure, if you're first, you're the one learning all the lessons. And we have learned numerous lessons throughout the life of this project, all which I think makes us better in the long run. But I think the biggest thing that the public rightfully critiques is the schedule and why we're not already in operations. And there's a couple of answers to that. The first thing is when voters passed Proposition 1A way back when, they passed a bond bill that gave us $9 billion in funding, and that was never enough to fund the entire project. So there's a bit of a misconception that we had all the money in hand to get all this done. That was never the case. This project has never been fully funded. That being said, we have more funding now than we did back when Proposition 1A passed, and we're making use of that. We also received funding from the Obama administration under ARA, and that federal funding had to be spent by a date certain. And when you do that, oftentimes you get into construction earlier than perhaps you should have. And that's what occurred when we broke ground on this project. We got into construction before all the right-of-way was in hand, before all utility relocation work had been done. Those are lessons learned, and they were done for the right reasons at the time because we had to spend that money by a date certain. Going forward, that's not the order of operations that this project will have. And we're already seeing that as we design, we have extended design contracts into Merced and down into Bakersfield to bring construction to 171 miles. We're doing advanced design first. We're going to map right of way. We're going to do utility relocations. Then we're going to get into construction contracts. That will help mitigate cost issues. That will help the schedule. It's just the order that things need to be done moving forward. So a lot of lessons learned in that regard. Also, as you're a new organization and working on building something that's never been built in the United States, there are going to be things that are going to continue to be learned as the process evolves. It's constantly moving, but I think we're a better organization today than we were at the beginning, and we'll be better 10 years from now than we were today. So it's all a process.
How is inflation impacting you at the moment?
I think inflation is impacting our program the same way it's impacting all of my colleagues here around the table, so to speak. It's record high inflation right now. This is not something isolated to our project. As you heard our CEO report to our board of directors last week, projects around the country are feeling the impacts of inflation. It is record high inflation right now. Caltrain electrification in the Bay Area here in California is experiencing it. Projects on the East Coast are experiencing it. This is not just isolated to California high-speed rail. This is construction projects around the country, and we're managing it and we're working through it as best we can. We know it's not forever, but we have to adjust our cost estimates accordingly.
Great. Do we have results from the poll yet? Oh, there we are. Okay. So we've asked people if they have ridden a high-speed train and where they might have ridden. So 59% of our audience have ridden high-speed trains in Europe, and 12% in Japan, 5% have been to China, 27% here at home in the US, and 8% elsewhere. Only 23% have never ridden a high-speed train. So hopefully that will change in the next few years. All right, thanks everyone for participating on that. That's a great response. And Ali, I want to go back to you and ask you, about the secret sauce that you've learned as a private company investing in this, and how you'll apply that to the California project that you're doing, but also as you're building out to Orlando and ultimately up to Tampa.
Absolutely. So again, from our approach, we really do think it's simple. Our goal is to connect, city pairs that are too short to fly and too far to drive, which is that 200 to 300 mile range. These cities are already dynamic in nature, especially if you look at the Florida system. Miami is the gateway to Latin America. Orlando, one of the most visited cities in the country. Similar concept from the California to Nevada project. And these options they are already clogged and congested with no alternative except for air travel. So there's, limited services or limited ways to get there other than using your car. And our goal is to utilize existing transportation corridors to build these high-speed rail networks. This, we believe, is key. We've done this in our Florida system. We are leveraging the existing Florida East Coast Railway, about 195 miles of that from downtown Miami to Cocoa. It is essentially the backbone of Florida. It is why people moved to Florida and visited Florida, because it gave them an opportunity to visit and to be there. And then for our Brightline West project, we will utilize the I-15 corridor. So again, leveraging these existing assets that already have transportation modes allows us to not only speed up some of the environmental work, because they are, they're not greenfield projects, if you will. And it also allows us to leverage the capital from a better perspective, from a private perspective.
From your perspective, your experience so far in these projects, do you see an opportunity for other private investors to come into this space?
Absolutely. I think it ranges on what your definition of what a private investor is. If you look at our South Florida system, from a transportation perspective, we have several of our county partners who are looking to leverage our investment to develop and further extend, commuter rail projects to further tie the region together, which we believe is extremely important from a connectivity standpoint. But from a private developer perspective, you really do see private developers taking advantage of this reconnected region, if you will, the development that's happening around our stations, within walking distance of where we've located our hubs. The planned development that's going in place is truly astronomical. And it just goes to show you what kind of investments, again, spurs more investment and obviously more job creation and more tourism opportunities. So for us, we've seen that as, again, very beneficial and something that we enjoy working with both the private and the public sector on. Again, as a private company, we can't do this alone. In Florida alone, we go through 50 cities and 8 counties. So public participation and coordination with key agencies is really, really important for us.
Excellent, excellent. Jim, one of the things Ali was just talking about was the connectivity, and that in her case with the commuter lines and other transportation forms. What's the importance of the connectivity, whether it be from high-speed rail to the long-distance Amtrak network or other Amtrak or other services, public transportation, et cetera? What's the importance of that connectivity?
Well, I mean, it's really the key to efficiency and growth. And you'll often hear it referred to as the network effect. And that is so very important to understand, that we're not talking about going from this origin to this destination. We're talking about connecting dozens and dozens and dozens of places and making hundreds of different trip combinations possible. And so to the extent that you can connect to, say, a commuter rail or so forth, you increase the value of the entire network, the entire system, because you make a wider range of journeys possible. And why that's important is that that's what brings you the economic return that Ali was talking about. And by the way, that's not confined to private investment, right? You see this effect everywhere you make these kinds of investments. And so typically, if you put the investment into a community of rail service, the fact of that service tends to generate it attracts private capital, it attracts retail, it attracts construction, it attracts residential places. So what happens is you get this sort of beneficial, almost like a kind of ripple effect, so that you develop areas around these stations, anywhere from a quarter mile to maybe 2/3 of a mile from around a station, that radius. And one of the reasons that happens is because of that network effect, because people are drawn to it for other purposes and realize that there's a benefit to being there more than just passing through on the train. So the connectivity is one of the sort of, you asked earlier about secret sauce. You call it connectivity, we would call it network effect, but it's kind of the same thing. Those multiple connections, those multiple touch points that make literally hundreds of different trip combinations possible on a single service or connection. That's one of the secret sauce elements that leads to that economic development that takes place around the lines.
Great, great, thanks. Roger, I wanted to ask you about the Northeast Corridor. There's a lot of work that I know is going into that. You will have the Gateway project for the Hudson tunnels coming underway. Actually, it started a bit. Going to be replacing the Baltimore and Potomac tunnel, the old Civil War era tunnel, a number of bridges and other infrastructure pieces. Can you talk about that a little bit and how that will help train service in the Northeast?
Yeah, sure. And let me just build on what Jim was saying. So, it's about connectivity. And what's really interesting about the Northeast Corridor is that even though that is, essentially it's known for Amtrak in general, but we only carry about 10% of the traffic in parts because the commuter agencies carry so much, such a high volume of passengers. And so this is part of that connectivity that Jim was talking about too, because when you have so many passengers meeting in the same place, using the same stations, it creates connectivity on its own, especially with the high frequencies that we have in these markets. But essentially today we offer a regional product and a high-speed premium product called Acela, which we talked about. Acela is being replaced this year. We're starting with new train sets. But essentially we're offering the intercity spine between Washington and Boston, and our regional services and commuter services backfill with lower price, slightly slower journey times. But we have the whole inventory of projects that you mentioned. So we have two major tunnel projects, Gateway and the Frederick Douglass tunnel going in Baltimore, but we also have a collection of bridges and other infrastructure developments that run into the billions and billions of dollars. Each bridge structure can cost up to $2 billion in terms of the entire project. So we have multiple of those, mainly on the Maryland shore and up in north of New York and then in the Connecticut area. One, which our partner Jersey Transit is taking the lead on, the Portal North Bridge is already under construction. I went by it on Monday and I could see the footings for the bridge already being sunk. And it's just evidence that this infrastructure work is underway and it's going to be building a far better future for the Northeast Corridor.
And how's your ridership doing? Are you having recovery? How's it recovered from the pandemic?
So first of all, we had a very strong recovery coming out of the pandemic. We've restored all but one of the services that we operated pre-COVID, and that service will be restored in a couple of months now. So we're basically back to all the services, not quite the same capacity, about 90% of capacity for a variety of reasons. But the good news is that in the Northeast, for instance, we're back to 90% of demand, pre-COVID demand. So we're basically filling the trains as full, if not fuller than pre-COVID. Now, there are a couple of overlapping factors here that are kind of complementing each other. One is business travel is not back to the way it was before COVID. It's only about 2/3 recovered, I would say. And commuting is definitely way off. But since we're an intercity operator, we didn't carry a lot of commuters in the first place. So we're not terribly impacted by the drop in commuter demand. What we're seeing though is a lot of leisure customers coming back to traveling, wanting to buy premium products. And we're also seeing a lot of new customers we've never seen before. So this is why our demand is so healthy, because we have a lot of leisure customers and we're seeing a lot of new customers. And we think this is just a great portent for the future, because we're essentially building tomorrow's customers today by giving them a good experience and having them want to come back.
Great, great. So we have a lot of money going into Amtrak, a lot of expansion there and upgrading and so forth. Melissa, obviously you're involved in a very expensive project as well. What kind of how does that fit into the picture of the cost of construction projects, especially transportation construction projects. We have some of the highest costs to do that here in the U.S. compared to other nations. What's your perspective on that? And is there ways that you can increase efficiencies?
In terms of
either time or cost?
Sure. I think some of that's what I touched on earlier is the steps, the orders of operation to get into construction. I think that plays a large role in cost and mitigation efforts there. Bear in mind what we're creating here in California is a grade separated, entirely new alignment for high-speed rail. So I think that is something to keep in mind when we're discussing cost. Also, the cost of what we're building is, different just by nature of what we have to do in California for CEQA and NEPA efforts for environmental purposes. So I think, again, what I touched on in the beginning, order of operations, making sure you have all your design, your pre-construction before you get into construction, that helps mitigate cost efforts. Really working with the communities in which you're touching to make sure things are done appropriately. Some of them are going to increase costs, some of them are going to bring down costs. It just depends on where you are in the state of California. It's a 500-mile long project, touching on very dense areas of the state like Los Angeles proper and San Francisco proper, and then the middle of the state, which has often been overlooked in terms of rail and transit and connectivity, which is imperative to the success of this project, connecting those communities of the Central Valley to areas of the state that have they need to be connected to, and they haven't for years. So it's a give and take when you're working through cost on a project of this scope and magnitude.
It's not uncommon. All major projects which I've seen, for example, in New York with the opening of Grand Central Madison Terminal, $11 billion project there, and they can take a lot of time. Oftentimes the public doesn't quite understand why that is. What do you say to folks who are asking you about the magnitude of costs?
I think the first thing to keep in mind is to build the capacity that we're building. If you were to expand highways and expand airport runways, not only would you not get GHG savings that electrified high-speed rail creates, but it would be 2 times or more the cost here in California. So I think that is really important to note. We're building something that, yes, has a high price tag. It's also 500 miles long. I cannot stress that enough. That is larger than some states in the country. So Los Angeles to San Francisco by traditional rail takes somewhere upwards of 14-ish hours. By car, it depends on what level of traffic you're sitting in. Between San Francisco and LA, somewhere between 6, 7, 8 hours. I know when I drive from Sacramento to see my folks, it just depends on what hour we leave and how much traffic we're hitting. So I think you have to put the benefits and the cost sort of in the same boat. What we're building, yes, is expensive, but it is absolutely worth it if we want to leave a lasting impact in a positive way on this country in terms of reduction of GHG emissions. If we want to move people quickly from one end of the state to the other, if we want to provide connectivity to portions of the state and populations of the state that have often been overlooked, that don't have these mobility options. Not everyone can drive a car. Not everyone has access to rail and transit. We as a country need to do better, especially on the West Coast, to make that happen. East Coasters, I love going to the East Coast. You can get on a train and go anywhere. In California, we don't always have that luxury. We need to do better, and we're working to do better, but that does come at a higher cost.
Great, thanks. Jim, I think you wanted to add something to that.
I just think it's important to expand a little bit on something that Melissa noted. It's important for people to get past the sort of the retail price tag, if you will, of some of these projects. There is a cost to doing nothing. And I think people don't recognize that. And I think that's true if you're looking at California high-speed rail. It's true if you're looking at Amtrak investments. It's true if you're looking at what's happening with Brightline West. There is congestion that has a cost. There's all of the things that go with congestion. There's missed opportunity. There's all kinds of things that if you do absolutely nothing, over a period of 10, 15 years, you're still going to spend billions of dollars. You're going to waste it in the form of missed economic opportunity, road fatalities. I mean, I could go on, but we have to compare these things against the sort of, as I said, sort of the retail price tag of a lot of these projects. And then in turn, you have to look at what they're going to bring back to the community, because every single trip on a train into or out of a community is an opportunity for revenue generation, not just for the train itself, but for the community visited. And that's the part that a lot of people forget, that it's not about just getting on the train and getting off the train. It's what do you do when you get there, and what money gets spent while you're there. And those are all benefits that come back to the community. And so once you start to add all those things together, then you start getting into, what Melissa's saying. Yes, we're going to spend a lot of money, but we're also going to generate a lot of good. And there's actually a benefit, a monetary benefit attached to that good.
And that's happening now too, Jim. And I know you know this well. In California, the benefits of building in the Central Valley, 70+% of our workforce in labor is from the Central Valley. So they're staying in their communities and they're investing in their communities. And that is huge. That's an area of the state where labor jobs prior to this project were not plentiful. And these men and women in the trades were leaving their communities and investing and spending money elsewhere in the state or elsewhere in the country because they needed work and they needed jobs. And that just wasn't available in the labor industry in their region. And now it is 70%.
Great, great. And I think we want to hear from our other two panelists on this topic as well. But before we do that, I think we have another poll. If we can get that going. And while that's running, this poll, we're asking the question, should the US invest in high-speed rail? So we'll get that answer in a few minutes, but Roger, I'll jump over to you.
Yeah.
What are the economic benefits that are coming from the investments that you'll be making?
So Dan, I was going to go back and just expand on the last point first, which is
great.
It's not just the cost of doing nothing, but it's the fact that everything's expensive. So if you look back across the last 20 years, we estimate that in Europe, they've spent $1 trillion on rail investments. And this country has spent 1.3 trillion, just the federal government, 1.3 trillion on highway investment. And, relative to that, Amtrak has spent a couple $2 billion a year on capital investments. So the order of magnitude is just so far off in terms of, we hear a number like, the Baltimore Tunnel or California high-speed rail. And sure, billions are lots of, that's a lot of money. But infrastructure is expensive, and it's expensive everywhere. And yes, construction costs in the US may be higher than many other countries, but it's still big money. And these projects take a lot of time. The average high-speed rail project in the world, it takes 16 years, and many of them take longer than that. So it's big no matter what it is, and no matter what your measuring stick. But we do see, economic benefit in places like Manhattan around our new Moynihan train hall facility there. We've seen investments in the local community. It's right next to Hudson Yards, which was a project with similar timing, and it's really revitalized that part of Manhattan. And we see it in other communities where people are, very eager to get a station in their locality because they know how much it drives other business. As Jim was saying, a quarter to 2/3 of a mile from a station, there's a lot of economic activity going on with people who are going to or from that nexus of transportation, which is the station. And so what we can do to improve that is to improve the multimodality, the connectivity of all these different forms of transportation. And it will eventually also improve real estate prices as people really want to move into these areas and take advantage of transit-oriented development.
Great. And Allie, would you like to weigh in on this? And what's your thoughts on the economic benefits?
I mean, I would agree with everything that everybody has said. From an economic perspective, like I mentioned, we're already seeing this significant transformation in the downtowns in South Florida. But I think one thing that we've lightly touched on too is that quality of life benefit, right? So removing cars from roadways, Jim mentioned the traffic fatalities, right? All of these things contribute to, and transportation contributes to more walkable communities, to areas where people want to live, work, and play. And so the increased transportation network that we continue to see really helps to support that. And then when you have additional investments being made to support, whether it's in connections to stations from, a bike ped perspective, additional multimodal connections, how that all ties together really does help to improve, again, the quality of life for these communities and where we're operating. And so we're big proponents, from an economic perspective and a quality of life perspective, and then a job perspective. Melissa mentioned the job numbers. How are we creating jobs? How are we sustaining these communities? Brightline Florida has created, thousands of jobs. Brightline West is expected to create the same amount, if not more. So it's, again, bringing impact back to the communities and where we are doing construction, and then we'll ultimately operate.
Great. How's our poll doing? What have we got some results on the latest poll? We certainly do. Our audience is very interested in having more high-speed rail. 97% of the respondents here say that yes, the US should invest in high-speed rail. So I guess we all have to get to work on that. You all have to get to work on that. I'm just a journalist. We also are getting some great audience questions here. So I'm going to see what some interesting questions are we have here. Roger, there's a question here asking what Amtrak's plans are to overhaul the fleet for both intercity and long distance trains.
Well, as I said, we do have procurement programs that are underway to actually replace a lot of the intercity and long distance fleets. And so we will see all new fleets by the middle of the next decade. However, in the meantime, we're spending something about $28 million to overhaul our long distance fleet. We already have 125 locomotives on order, but we're also refreshing the interiors of all of the coaches, sleeping cars, dining cars, lounges. About half the coaches have already been done. The sleeping cars started this month. But there's a limited amount of work that can be done before the new procurements arrive. But we are very focused on keeping all those products competitive in the meantime. And I will say this, on the Acela services, which we had hoped to retire the old train sets by now, but unfortunately we haven't been able to yet. We are continuing to focus on state of good repair and making sure that those products meet the expectations of our customers.
Terrific. And there's a question here for Ali specifically. This question says, I've been on Brightline in Miami and you had really good connections to other modes of travel. What are your plans for similar connectivity in Orlando and Las Vegas?
Sorry, I had to take myself off mute there. No, so that's a great question. And first last mile connectivity is of the utmost importance to us. I mean, we have a whole department that is dedicated on solving that first and last mile. In Brightline, Florida, we actually just announced our partnership with Uber. We're taking Brightline Plus to the next level, and we're the first high-speed rail system, in the nation, actually, to connect into Uber through our electronic platform, so through our app and through our website. In each of our stations in South Florida, we are connected to the existing transportation systems. And again, I mentioned the public sector is looking at leveraging our investment to continue to grow them. But our connectivity in Brightline West will be just as great. So our Rancho Cucamonga station will connect to California MetroLink, which will give guests access to all of South California, and our Las Vegas station is located right off of the Strip, just 10 minutes from the airport. And we are already working with gaming and resorts to ensure connectivity, which is very similar to many of the things that we do for Brightline Florida. So for us, connectivity is key. I'll also say for our Florida system, placing our stations strategically to areas that are live, work, and play. You can get off and walk to Performing Arts Center, walk to courthouses, walk to government centers, walk to residential complexes, as we've talked about. Again, all of that makes the decision to take transportation instead of your car that much more of an easier one to make.
Great, great. And Jim, there's a question here I think you can speak to. This question asks, what steps would be helpful for more connectivity with transit?
Well, what steps for whom? I mean, there's clearly, you know, a role for, as we start looking at the corridor ID program, the Federal Railroad Administration is administering, plus the long distance study that's happening on long distance services. One of the really important elements there is working with local communities, and that's where that's going to take place. I think, you know, Ali was talking about, what was it, 50 communities that you pass through. So a lot of that is about that sort of, you know, constant open line of communication to the localities, and that's where a lot of those local connections are going to take place. Now, I'm not sure if that's what the person was asking about. If they were asking about what they personally can do, this is where I think, you know, this is what we try to tell everyone about, is the power of grassroots advocacy. The reason why there's a bipartisan infrastructure law with over $70 billion of dedicated money for passenger rail expansion in the United States is because thousands and thousands of people contacted their mayors, their county commissioners, their congressmen, their senators, and said, I live here, I vote here, this is important to me, and I care about it. And that's how that gets done. And so that happens at the local level too. So, you know, you can do a lot more than just voting. And that's where we think there's, you know, if you think there's a need for connectivity in a particular place, that's where you, as someone who lives there, works there, plays there, can raise your hand and say, yes, this is something I believe in, and ask your local officials to work on it.
If I may, Dan, I would love to echo that statement from Jim. You know, I think that too often we talk about what we'd like to see rather than advocating for it. And there's always another side that is advocating for something different, you know, than what others want. And, you know, anti-voices can tend to be louder than those that are pro something. And again, it takes, you know, to buy into a vision obviously takes a lot of trust, and you want to see something accomplished. And for all of us here to be able to do that, you know, you absolutely have to be able to express that, you know, in the terms of voting, and then also in terms of participating at the local level, you know, for what future connections and, you know, ultimate multimodal connections that you'd like to see. So I think that's a great point, Jim, and one that we don't talk about enough is, you know, in order to continue to move these things forward, people need to be involved and to support those efforts.
Melissa, would you like to add to that?
I think my colleague summed it up quite nicely.
Great, great. Well, I do have a question, I think, for you. There's a question here asking about high speed versus high frequency. And I don't know that the two are independent, but there's a concern, obviously, if the trains only run every few hours, then it's not as convenient. You know, if my alternative is just, I'm going to jump in my car and drive, right? Maybe what is the planning ahead when you begin to operate in the Central Valley as to frequencies?
Sure. Let me just give a small example. So in the Central Valley, it's going to cut trip times between 90 and 100 minutes. So that alone, I think, is impactful, especially if you've driven anywhere in California. That's valuable time with your families and loved ones, or you know, productive time at work. So that in itself is huge. It'll also double the number of trains frequency in the Central Valley. So I think there may be some misconception to the number of trains we're running and the frequency in which we're running them. Of course, we're starting in the Central Valley because that's where we're funded to have construction right now. We're going to expand into San Francisco proper and Los Angeles proper as funding becomes available. But I think it's going to increase the number of train trips. I know it's going to increase the number of train trips in the Central Valley to begin with, and obviously cut trip times by 90 to 100 minutes, which is huge.
Great, great. There's an interesting question here from one of our viewers about how electric aviation, particularly these eVTOLs, also known as advanced air mobility, et cetera, could affect ridership on trains in the future. Now you're not up and running yet, so maybe I should throw this to Roger or Jim. I don't know have you thought about these new technologies that might give travelers other options?
Can't wait for this. Go ahead, Roger.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I think it's a little bit like electric vehicles, which is, you know, they have a real purpose, but the thing about rail is the density that it offers for transportation. So, you know, even if everybody had an electric car and drove it themselves, or if they had some other kind of electric flying device, we would quickly be overwhelmed by the volume and complexity of managing all of that. And the great thing about rail, and high-speed rail in particular, is it's very efficient at moving large numbers of people fast. And I don't think you can get away from that. So I think some of these things can be complementary.
Can I jump in on that too? I'll say this both as someone who, many people probably already know this, I spent 26 years of my career at Aviation Week in space technology. So I'm pretty plugged in on that part of the world too. And Roger's absolutely right. You know, the key to efficiency really is moving lots of people quickly. And, you know, if I have, say, 4 people in an eVTOL, okay, that's great. But I can put, you know, 300 people on a train potentially. And in the meantime, there's the idea of the city pairs and that efficiency. So again, I just have to, you know, let's take a single point-to-point trip, you know, between 2 places, right? 2 stops. That makes 3, doing math in public, this is terrible, but that makes 3 trip combinations possible, right? Now, if I have, say, 10 stops on a train route, that's 55 possible trip combinations. That's 55 possible ways of doing that trip. And every trip is an opportunity for economic development. So that's the sort of again, I said this earlier, sort of that secret sauce idea. You know, once you get into, you know, 20, 30, you know, stations, I mean, we just said 55 for 10 stations, make that 20 stations. Now it's 210 possible trip combinations. Every one of those is an opportunity to generate economic benefit. So there's that element of it. The other element of it, just speaking as an aviator, the aviation system is incredibly conservative in terms of adopting new technology. I think, you know, Roger from his background could probably agree with that. You know, you've already got an air traffic control system that is struggling to understand what drones are. And I think from the perspective of someone who uses the system, I think we're a long way off from having the kind of dense airways full of these kinds of vehicles that would make a difference. So I have to throw that out there. You know, we already operate, I think it's 4,000 commercial flights per day in the air traffic control system in the United States. And that doesn't even include all the general aviation traffic, but, you know, Cessna 172s and that kind of thing. So that's an awful lot of eVTOLs and all of those kinds of vehicles to be into the system. And I just don't think we're there yet.
Oh, great, thanks. While we're looking at some maybe misperceptions, there's a question here, Melissa, I think you would like to respond to in terms of what progress has been made on the California high-speed rail venture to date.
Absolutely.
Is there a perception out there that you'd like to address?
Yeah, I think that there's always a question of what has been done on this project, unless you are physically in the Central Valley. Sometimes that's hard to see. And obviously with environmental work, that's very hard to see because that's environmental clearance. That's mainly done community engagement and behind the scenes on paper. So I think a couple of points that I would like to raise. When our current CEO, Brian Kelly, took over about 5 years ago, we only had the Central Valley environmentally cleared, 119 miles of Central Valley. Today, we have 422 of the 500 miles environmentally cleared. By the end of this year, we will have all of Los Angeles to San Francisco environmentally cleared. That is huge. That is a huge, huge undertaking and a tremendous amount of staff time to engage with these communities in a meaningful way to make sure that our project is listening to the concerns of the community and really not having an adverse impact. We want to leave communities in a better way than we've came through. So that's the first and foremost thing. Second, I touched on it a little bit at the beginning. We have 119 miles under active construction. We're expanding that out to 171 miles. We will have construction completed on our southernmost section of construction this year by late spring, early summer of this year. Civil works will be done. We are currently designing the 4 Central Valley stations, which again, I noted are the first high-speed rail stations in the country. These are all tremendous, tremendous undertakings. We are funding partners for the electrification of the Caltrain program in the Bay Area. We are funding partners for the modernization of Los Angeles Union Station. We are funding partners for some major grade separations that are critical safety projects in Northern and Southern California, one of which is complete. The other one broke ground last year. So these are all progress points that I think are really notable. And then of course, the creation of jobs, you can't stress that enough, more than 10,000 labor jobs created since this project broke ground. So tons of work is being done, tons of progress is being made. I know it's not often easy to see, but we're trying our best to get that word out there as often as we can, especially on our digital media platforms.
Terrific, terrific. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time here. It's been great, but I'd like to ask each of you, so usually the last question I ask when I'm speaking with interesting people, what question has not been asked, have I not asked, or our audience has not asked that you would like to talk to? I'll start with you. You're on camera now, Melissa.
I think that I don't want to take up my colleagues' time, but I love driving home that point that work is happening, progress is being made, and we're really proud of the work we're doing to bring 220-mile-an-hour electrified high-speed rail to the United States.
Great, great. Allie, what would you like? What would you
Sure.
like to?
I think that, if you've been to Florida, if you've experienced Brightline, I think one of the questions is kind of what makes us different. If you've been on Brightline, you recognize that we really are focused all about the guest experience. In Europe, when you take high-speed rail, as most people had from the panel, the station has a different owner or operator than the train system. In Brightline, again, we control that experience from the second that you book your ticket on your phone or the website to arriving at the station to being on the train. Again, we're hospitality focused. Our trains are the most ADA accessible. We again, our locomotives meet the Tier 4 emission standards set by the Federal Railroad Administration. So everything that we've done is really focused again on what we saw when we traveled throughout the world that we thought was missing. If you go to airports, the number one thing you see are people sitting in a circle around one charging station. I mean, how crazy is that we are connected to our devices constantly, and there's one device to use from how many hundreds of people. So for us, a simple solution was every seat has multiple chargers, USB outlets, and the same thing in the station. So again, we're really focused on the guest experience, but also leveraging existing infrastructure corridors to bring this investment to reality as quickly as possible.
Great, thank you, Allie. Jim, what would you like to add as a final thought to this conversation?
I think one thing that I would really like to see us focus on is that it's not just about high-speed rail versus conventional rail or conventional rail versus highways. We have a transportation ecosystem. Every mode has its ideal use case, right? Every trip has its ideal mode. And so we need to look at it holistically as a country and recognize that we need a surface transportation strategy that includes high-speed rail, that includes conventional rail, that includes selective highway changes. It includes light rail, it includes first mile, last mile, and it can take all kinds of forms. It can be bicycles, it can be Uber. We have to recognize that we have to get out of this sense of this versus that, and this costs less and this costs more, because it all costs. And if we do nothing, that also costs. So we really need to look more at outcomes and what we want to spend to produce those outcomes. And I think once we do that, we'll start to recognize that high-speed rail in the long run is a very sensible investment as part of the transportation ecosystem of the United States.
Great, thanks, Jim. And I'll leave the last word for Roger. What would you like to add?
I want to respond to two things that came up in the chat. One is about accessibility. So we have our station accessibility program has a budget of $1.75 billion to improve accessibility. And the majority of that money was made possible through the IIJA. So that's, I think, real customer focused benefit being delivered from the bipartisan infrastructure law. The other thing is someone asked about the Midwest and said, hey, I didn't hear anything about the Midwest, and there's good stuff going on there. So all the Midwest states got together. They have 88 new rail cars, adventure cars being delivered. We're putting them to service as fast as they're made available. And there are two sections of the Midwest where 110-mile-an-hour service is either already in service or will be soon. That's in the Michigan service between Chicago and Detroit, and in Illinois between Chicago and St. Louis. So the Midwest is not left out. That's not everybody's definition of high-speed rail, but as Jim said, 110 is really good, and we need way more of that. So it's really throughout the country, and it's about making the mode more competitive.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I think that kind of brings us to a conclusion here. Morgana?
Yeah, it sure does. Wow, thank you all to the whole panel for such a great conversation. You had all incredible insights. Thank you, Dan, of course, for expertly moderating it. Thanks to everybody who's listening. We had such an active chat today, so really appreciate that participation. Next month on CoMotion Live, we'll have our episode on college safe rides. So really looking at affordability and accessibility for college students on campuses. So yeah, thank you so much again, and stay tuned for that announcement. And I guess see you next time.
Great seeing everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
all.
you.